Hello, I'm Jim Turkter, the director of the Center for Free Expression, and I'd like to welcome you to today's In Conversation event that we're sponsoring. Today, we're going to be looking at having a frank discussion about racism and how it slips and mutates across the U.S.-Canada border. But before we get to that, I'd like to first acknowledge the land on which I'm speaking to today is the territory of many nations, notably the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee, the Chippewa, and the Wendat peoples, and is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis. I'd also acknowledge that Toronto is covered by Treaty 13 with the Mississaugas of the Credit and the Williams Treaty with multiple Mississauga and Chippewa bands. I'd also like to thank our co-sponsors for today's session, which are the Toronto Public Library, the Edmonton Public Library, the Vancouver Public Library, and PEN Canada. Our conversation today is going to be focusing on our featured guest, who is Debra Thompson. Debra is the Canada Research Chair in Racial Inequality in Democratic Societies at McGill University and a leading scholar in comparative politics of race. She's the author of a book which is going to be central to our discussion today. It's a book that she's recently written entitled The Long Road Home on Blackness and Belonging, which, as she describes, explores the nuances of racism in Canada and the United States. From her perspective as a descendant of refugees from slavery in the United States that escaped to Canada before the US Civil War, and then a person who went to work in the United States in 2010 to take up a Shirk postdoctoral fellowship with the Center for American Political Studies at Harvard University, and then taught at the University of Oregon, Northwestern University, and Ohio University before returning to Canada to teach at McGill. Welcome, Debra.
Thank you for having me.
Our pleasure. In conversation with Debra will be Vershawn Young, or as he prefers to be called, Vay. Vay is a professor of Black Studies, Communication, Arts, and English at the University of Waterloo, and a member of the Center for Free Expression's Advisory Board. He's also an actor and a lawyer who was born and raised in the United States and who came to Canada to teach at the University of Waterloo. Welcome, Vay. Our format for today's session will be Vay and Debra will have a conversation for about 45 to 55 minutes. And then we're going to open up the conversation to members of the audience. In this webinar version of Zoom, if you look at the bottom of your screen, you'll see a Q&A button. And we'd like to encourage you, as you're listening to their conversation, if questions come to mind, issues you'd like to explore with them come to mind, click on the Q&A button and write them down as you're listening to their conversation. You don't have to wait till we turn to the audience. And Ange Holmes, who's the coordinator for the Center for Free Expression, will be compiling the questions. And when Vay and Debra are prepared to turn to the audience, Vay will ask Debra for, Ange for the first question, and they'll discuss it and go on to the other one. So please, we really want audience engagement and your questions to be a feature of what we do. So please write them down as you think of them in listening to their conversation. With that, I'll turn this over to Debra and Vay. Look forward to their conversation.
Thank you, Jim. Appreciate that introduction. And Debra, I appreciate being in this conversation with you. I just want to give a little bit of background for the audience and to thank you for being so generous with your time and your research and your intellectual proclivities. I was introduced to your work and to you by somewhat happenstance because I was in the bookstore. I was in the bookstore at Waterloo, and it was around the time that I was teaching the first ever Black Studies class at the University of Waterloo, a class called Introduction to Black Arts, Culture, and Literature. And I like to be surprised by books and for books to jump out at me that are relevant. And I was in the bookstore, and yours was featured like right at the when you walk in. It was on a stand, and I picked it up, and it is a really truly wonderful book that fit right into my course. I contacted you to be a guest speaker in the course, and you accepted that invitation. You were so kind and generous to my students and took their questions, and they wanted to have more information. I offered you an honorarium, a small one, to speak, but you said put it back for the students. So they were each able to get a copy of the book, and were able to provide copies to other people because they were able to buy more than one. So thank you for that. So
I feel I have all kinds of feelings about this. This is the fact that my book is in bookstores is still shocking because, as you know, when you write academic books, they never show up in bookstores. They and sometimes they don't even show up in libraries.
right.
Sometimes, they only show up in that box that you get, the publisher sends you your author copies, and then you never see hide nor hair of it ever again. So that's an incredible story. And I remember meeting your students now, and they were lovely. They were lovely. I love the chance to speak with them. It was amazing.
So, Deborah, I'm going to ask you some questions and be in conversation with you about some topics in the book,
Mhm.
but we don't have to spend the entire time talking about the book. That will probably segue into some other issues um, as well. I wanted to have this kind of conversation with other scholars
Mhm.
and thinkers who are writing about race, racism, the construction of Blackness, and the experience of Blackness in the US and Canada at this moment, particularly because um, after 2020, like after the situation with George Floyd, which you open your book with as a segue into what you're discussing there, there was immediately I would say, global response to what people began to articulate their understanding about systemic institutional racisms that could give rise to the kind of situation that happened in Minneapolis with George Floyd and his aggressor, right? It wasn't just in law enforcement, but it was in educational institutions, in public sectors, and so forth, with a number of institutions and sectors issuing statements, right, about the vileness of racism and how it affects and impacts our daily lives, not just Black people or Indigenous peoples, but everybody, right, one way or another. But we're in 2024, and it seems to me as if those statements, well, let me put it another way. It seems to me as if what was intended in those statements has not materialized.
Yeah.
That really in 2024, after 4 years, 4 years in the aftermath of what transpired with George Floyd, it almost seems like May 24th, 2020, again, like the day before all that happened. That's my estimation. Like the advancement of understanding and commitments to intervening into systemic oppressions have not obtained. And the discourse, the discussions, the conversations around it also have recessed, right, and diminished. I wonder if you notice the same thing, or if you have any sort of connection to what I'm articulating about our moment now.
Yeah, I think that's a great question. It's a really big question. Um, or a large comment. Let me give you two answers. The first is about those statements that came out, and a lot, one came out of your university, one came out of my university, one came out of the coalition of universities. There were a number of corporations, really like everyone put out a statement about condemning systemic racism and vowing to do better. And the question, I guess, the question is whether or not action followed those statements, and the kind of action that can enact meaningful change. And on that note, I don't know. I saw a lot of effort. Certainly at my university, we did end up hiring a number of Black faculty. But that being said, when you're talking about, like I was the 12th Black faculty member hired at McGill out of 1,700. And I think now we have maybe 30, maybe 40 out of 1,700. So it's still, we're still talking about, we're making progress, but the progress is so small and so incremental. And I think that my sense from a lot of the statements and initiatives that came out of certainly corporate Canada, I can't speak to corporate America, I wasn't following it nearly as closely, is those folks just didn't even know where to begin. Like most organizations weren't even collecting racial data. And whatever efforts, whether they were genuine, whether they were misguided, whether they were just lip service, and I think there's something to be said for all three of those categories. Whatever the intention was, the outcome certainly hasn't demonstrated very much movement, I would argue as well. So in that, I think we're in agreement. On the second part of the question about the moment that we're in, if you know American racial history, you know that any moment of racial progress is met by disproportionate backlash against any kind of racial progress. And after the era of Reconstruction, we had the era of redemption, right? The redemption of white supremacist narratives, and the employment of the mechanisms of the state in order to really tear down any progress that had been made during Reconstruction. And so almost immediately after the murder of George Floyd, you saw the seeds of that moment. If you look at of redemption, of the clawback of racial progress. If you look at the public opinion data from the summer of 2020, we see like an immediate kind of peak in public support of Black Lives Matter around June. And then by September, public support of Black Lives Matter is at the same levels that it was before George Floyd was murdered, right? So the actual, as far as we could tell by those polls at least, actual support for Black Lives Matter had pretty much like diminished by the end of the summer. And certainly with the war on critical race theory that followed, the use of woke as a slur, the death threats that were sent to Black journalists in Canada, and the ways in which these very clear attempts to roll back any concessions that were made during the summer of 2020, combined with new and also familiar attacks on LGBTQ folks, trans kids, and other women's reproductive rights, and other elements of what we might call the culture war that it's all familiar. Like they're connected in very interesting ways that I'm still trying to think through. But the moment that we're in right now is really the resurgence, I think, of a lot of these populist, although that doesn't necessarily mean regressive, but these populist forces that are anti-racial progress, anti-LGBTQ rights, anti-women's reproductive rights, anti-progressive politics.
And while your book is very much a intellectual foray, academic understanding, it also has some personal elements to it, right? I mean, you get to meet you, get to know a little bit about your background.
You get to meet my dog.
Yeah, we know that that you were born in Canada, that you lived and worked in the US. for a time. We know that your father had U.S. Heritage from the enslavement period, and his ancestors migrated to Canada. That you have three siblings or four?
Three.
Three siblings, two sisters and a brother.
That's right.
And your parents are mixed race. Your father's Black,
The
your
Mount.
mother's white.
Mhm.
Okay. What else about your background is pertinent to this conversation and the book?
Oh my gosh. One thing I always talk to my students about, and there's a chapter in the book which I wrote begrudgingly. I guess my editors really wanted that chapter, and I ended up writing it at their request, and now I like it. But I write about being the only one, right? The only Black person in any space, and that's quite important. And the reason why it's important is because there's a lot of assumption about Canada as a multicultural, quote unquote, country, or the amount of diversity that Canada has, or the way in which various parts of Canada, what kinds of multiculturalism, what kinds of diversity exists there. And something I wanted to make clear in the book is that, Canada changes its immigration policy in 1967. We adopt a point system, which gets rid of the racial hierarchies that had previously been written into our immigration policy. Pierre Elliott Trudeau stands up in the House of Commons in 1971 and declares Canada to be a multicultural society. This gets constitutionalized in the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, Section 27 in 1982. And yet, in like the 1981 census, Canada is still like 98% white. Like non-white people and Indigenous people make up less than 2% of the Canadian population. Canada is a very, very, very white country until the mid-90s, I would argue. And in some places, and certainly the place where I grew up, what that meant was my siblings and I were frequently the only Black people in any room. And and that actually continued for me. Like for quite a while. I did my undergrad at Carleton University. So I moved to Ottawa around the turn of the century. It's crazy to say, but I moved to Ottawa around the year 2000. Ottawa is not a diverse, where it wasn't a diverse place when I was there. I think it's gotten more diverse since I left. And then I went to graduate school, and even as I went to the University of Toronto, which is, a huge university that has a huge student population, and certainly the satellite campuses like U of T Scarborough, U of T Mississauga have like incredible racial diversity, as does St. George's campus. Um, at graduate school was not diverse. Nor I would argue was the faculty in the department where I did my PhD. And so this sense of being kind of like the only Black person in many spaces really came to define my understanding of Blackness, which was very, very different, I should note, from a lot of other Canadian-born Black people, who grew up maybe in like Black communities outside Halifax, a historic Black community in Nova Scotia. Maybe folks grew up in Black communities that are descended from Caribbean immigrants in Toronto, but that definitely wasn't kind of my experience growing up in Canada, and it was quite different, I think, than a lot of folks' experiences growing up in cities in the U.S., where you had people who looked like you in a community, and people who could teach you about your history, your culture. You had Black teachers. The only Black teacher I laid eyes on was my father. And so any type of knowledge of Black history, Black culture, Black literature, I ended up having to pretty much to teach myself, with some help of some amazing mentors along the way. Not all of whom were Black, but all of whom were quite supportive of me.
Hmm. And you're a political scientist by training.
I mean, like in theory, yeah.
What do you
They
what do
haven't
you do?
revoked my degree yet.
So, I'm wondering, um, from your perspective as a political scientist, right? Because I'm a humanist,
Mhm.
and I can tell you things on about why I think the humanities, writing and reading literature and watching films and being engaged in cultural production is important to the kinds of conversations
Mhm.
you know, that we're having, particularly the one we're having today. But as a political scientist, what's important about political science? And to you as a political scientist, to conversations about race and racism across these borders?
Yeah, I mean, like you're asking the wrong person because I am barely a political scientist. I'm barely a political scientist. Um, so okay, so in political science, like the value of political science, I think, is not necessarily the way that I was trained in political science. I can say that. The value of political science is really its analysis of power, right? And certainly as political scientists, we tend, at least in Canadian political science, we tend to focus on the mechanics and the machinations of the state quite a bit. And I think there's certainly value in that. And certainly when you think about the role of the state in creating and maintaining conditions of inequality or in creating circumstances of racial violence, there really is there's no parallel actor, right? Like the state violence has been like any racial history at one way or another is going to lead you to the doorstep of the state, right? And even that Weberian definition of the state, which my students always are able to say off by heart because I drill it into them, but the state as an entity that maintains a monopoly over the use of violence in a given territory, the idea that that violence is at the core of what the state does, and that the role of the state is at least to promote or protect a particular kind of social order. And when that social order is defined by racial hierarchy, then the role of the state becomes to protect, promote, and maintain that kind of that racial hierarchy. So I think in part the value of political science is in the study of the state. It's also in the study of like resistance to those forms of oppression and domination. And certainly in the subfield where I live, which is race and ethnic politics, we take power very, very, very seriously. We also take evidence and empirical analysis very seriously. And I was just doing a presentation yesterday at Huron University College, where I am right now in a hotel room in London, as you can all see. And I was having an argument with an undergrad, and at one point I said something to the effect of like this isn't my opinion, like this isn't my opinion on race and racism. This is research. This is 20 years of research and empirical data. I can, you want the receipts? I got the receipts. I'm not making this stuff up. You want to know about wealth disparities between white and non-white people in this country? I can show you data on that. You want to know about the employment gap? I can show you that data. You want to know about like any other disparities in health, education, longevity, the impact of the environment, like all of it. We have data. We could use more. Don't get me wrong. And so I think the value, at least, of political science and the social sciences is in that empirical analysis. And with that being said, part of the reason why I'm not a great political scientist is because I also really value that the stories that people tell. I think that is valid evidence. And so I like to live with one foot in political science and one foot in Black studies. Certainly, when I worked at an African American Studies department at Northwestern, I felt a kind of freedom there to do the type of research the way that I wanted, that I hadn't felt as a political scientist. And if I could actually ask you a question as someone in the humanities, I've always been quite curious, and certainly because I was not trained in the United States, it seems to me that the humanities side of Black studies is so much larger, or so much, there's so much more, there's so much more research, or so much more going on in the arts, the humanities, history, literature than there ever maybe has been in political science and sociology. Like why is it that humanities have led the way in Black studies in the US? What's your sense of that?
Wow. Well, honest answer, I don't know. But I do know and observe the same, have the same observation in all of the Black studies departments that I've been in, and I've tried very diligently to have affiliation with Black Studies departments at every institution that I've worked at, and it's been about what, 4 institutions now. The humanities faculty in Black Studies was the majority.
Mhm.
If I had to hypothesize as to why that is the case, um, I would have to imagine that uh, because the humanities has so many different facets under the rubric of arts and humanities. That's not to say that that's not the same for science and social science. I mean, there are, but I mean, in terms of actually dealing with the felt, lived experience of people, um, I would say the humanities sort of is um, more primed in a
Mhm.
certain kind of way in dealing with that felt experience, right? The lived aspects of it and the representation, right? So when I think about it's a different kind of representation, let's say for a political scientist, I would imagine looking at census data, right? There is a representation there, but it's not in the same sort of felt lived way in which if you read a novel or watch a film and you see these things, a story being played out in front of your eyes, and rather you identify with the protagonist or with some other, maybe even the antagonist in the character, there is a felt sense that arises. And we have to grapple with that. And I think Black Studies has always required students, readers, and thinkers about Black topics to grapple with their own sense of self, their placement within uh, those discourses that are being represented and those that are similar, and their relationship with other people like themselves and others, right, that are dissimilar from oneself. That's why I think it is so prominent, right? But at the same time, I know departments like the one at Northwestern, that I have a lot of friends in that department, um, and elsewhere try for a breadth of different kinds of scholars to be in conversation about, um, you know, Black studies, to put a term to it.
Yeah, I think so. And I think as well, if I think about the study of race or Blackness from a social science perspective, part of being in the social science is that we purport to be the science of society. And science has often, at least projected itself as being objective and neutral. And a lot of that, well, one is that it's total bunk, right? There's no such thing as objectivity. It's cute that we try, though. And but and secondly, is the way that I think race and racism manifest. Actually, it's the way in which, like, the kind of racial arrogance, I would say, where Black people studying Blackness are always presumed to be biased. Or for another example is Black jurors are presumed to automatically be biased, but white jurors are presumed to be objective and neutral. And the same way thing kind of works in our attempts to think through scholarship and scholarly inquiry. When one studies race as a racialized scholar, it is presumed that you are doing, like me-search, not research. And the goal of objectivity and the idea, at least in political science, that we could isolate particular variables and then find causal relationships among them, requires a kind of simplification, which really runs counter to the very substance of race in the real world. We're talking about people's identities. They're super, super complicated. And so those scholars who do, as you said, like look at census data and look at the categories that we use in our censuses and just like take that Black category uncritically, like, yep, okay, 3.5% of the Canadian population is Black. Check. and not think about what identities mean, whether they change, whether someone's just taken a 23andMe test and decided they're Black, the entire pretendian phenomenon, how mixed race people identify, where those categories came from, how they've changed over time, the power relations involved. Like that's, I think, where the social sciences fall flat, and we need the humanities. So a lot of these attacks on the humanities are just, this is another conversation, obviously, but they are so problematic. We are creating a generation of people who do not know how to think, and it's so disheartening.
I agree. I told you I was going to ask you some questions about, some questions from your book, right? Or at least prime a conversation for us from your book. Here's one, an episode or anecdote that you provide about an episode of racism that you faced while you were in the States.
Mhm.
But you make a extension of this, not saying that there would be people who are more racially explicitly showing and demonstrating racial hatred, but from white liberal colleagues. I want to read it to you. Um, Before I read it to you, for the listeners, in the opening, you sort of ground part of your discussion in the words of sociologist W.E.B. Du Bois, from his Souls of Black Folks, and when he raises in the introduction uh, and said that the problem of the 20th century is the problem of the color line, and also ask, how does it feel to be a problem? You know, when he's opining about double consciousness and the two-ness that Black people feel, always looking at themselves through the eyes of others. Anyway, you said about this, question that Du Bois raises, how does it feel to be a problem? You write, I thought of this question when I began my first teaching position at Ohio University. I was running along the Hocking River path when a pickup truck zoomed by and a man's voice screamed, "Hey, nigger." It wasn't the first or the last time something like this happened, but the worst was yet to come, and it would come from my white liberal colleagues, so desperate to be seen as progressive and tolerant to my face, but resentful and vindictive behind my back.
Mhm. Yeah.
What's that about?
I mean, I was trying at the time, and I'm still trying to think about white liberals. And what I mean by that is small L liberals. Obviously, I'm not talking about a political party. I'm talking about an ideological orientation, right? So those folks who think of themselves as progressive, who, you know, in the context of when I was writing, it was people who like loved Obama so much. They, you know, they voted Democrat, they recycled, they went to farmers markets, they they fought, you know, for women's rights, they would go to protests, they like all of these hallmarks of being kind of a progressive ally. But when the chips were down, would ultimately, like, I found that many of them, like in political science, we have a theory about status threat. And the theory is essentially that whiteness as an identity it's kind of a latent identity. It exists, but it's not an active identity. So for example, in Canada, 40% of white people in public opinion polls report that whiteness has nothing to do with their sense of identity at all. Like being white has nothing to do with their identity. And so the theory around status threat indicates that whiteness gets activated when people believe that their status, their reputation, whether that's measured in, or whether like that status is about reputational power or wealth or income or social capital or whatever, when it's threatened by a Black person approaching that same level of status. So it's not an absolute measure, right? It's always comparative. And so what I found was that the more successful I was becoming in my early career, people were fine with me when I was a nobody. Like people were, my colleagues were fine with me when I was a nobody. And then when I started getting recognition and accolades is when the white liberals seemed to like me an awful lot less, I would say. And the type of racism that I faced from white liberals was never that overt, in your face racial slur on the street, not believing anything you say, sitting, I was once in a meeting when the person, one of the people in the meeting just turned his chair around and would not, like anytime I talked, he would just turn his chair around and not listen to what I was saying. That's not the kind of racism of white liberals, right? Though the racism of white liberals is that kind of the whisper network, like the indirect sabotage, the use of institutional mechanisms, the like that kind of like that polite, kind, maybe, even generous to your face, maybe not with like the explicit intention of sabotage, maybe not. Because part of, I think, what the issue of white liberals are is like they do not know how racist they actually are. Like they do not know the ways in which they uphold racial hierarchies with every fiber of their being. They really are not aware. And when slash if you were ever to confront them on it, this is the only place where I think Robin DiAngelo's theory of white fragility is really useful, because that is the world of white liberals is in reacting to the accusation of racism by recentering their own narratives through that range of defensive moves that DiAngelo talks about. And colleges and universities are just full of white liberals. We could tell stories for days, really, about the folks who have all the good intentions and all the appearances, and even some of them even taught classes on race, and yet we're quite threatened. And at the end of the day, we're terrible colleagues.
You, I'm not laughing at what you're saying. I'm laughing at the recognition of understanding in what you're describing.
Yeah. I mean, so like let me give you like, for people in the audience who maybe don't believe me, like just like a quick example. One of the things that's been happening to me a lot lately is like I get put on committees because these committees cannot always only be white men. They need to have a woman and a person of color, and I am both of those things. So I get put on committees, and these committees have 3 people, and then I get outvoted. And so I do all of this work, all of this labor for the end result, which is going to be the same. And those like 2 white men I'm sure they don't think they're racist. I'm sure they don't see the power dynamic. I'm sure like they don't think that they are dismissing everything I say and do, by allying with each other. And then I'm just like this voice of unreason in the corner, like challenging like their decision. And yet the end, that's what the end result is, and then I'm the one who's combative, right? When in fact, like it was set up in such a way that I couldn't have been anything but.
I'm a little more pessimistic in my perspective than you're articulating. You were saying that that colleagues or white liberals don't know basically how racist they are. I disagree.
Yeah, you think so?
Oh, I mean,
They
wait, so
don't know, or they don't care.
both. No, I think they don't care, and I think they do know. But here's the reason why I say that. You cannot be in the academy and claim to be an intellectual and claim to be thinkers and not be able to understand race and our own situatedness and positions and actions when it comes to interracial interactions. I just don't believe that they don't know. I think that it's part of the strategic ideological performance, right? That governs those actions.
Mhm.
I think that the fact that white people can be in a majority, let's say in a predominantly white institution, gives them the freedom and license to claim or cloak their strategic moves and performances in I don't know, or
Mhm.
it's not me,
Mhm.
or I'm not a person of color,
Mhm.
right? The reason why that's important for me to articulate is because the opposite is not true. We're never allowed to say because I'm a person of color, I don't know. Because I'm a Black person, there's no excuse on anything.
Yeah.
So I don't, you're not giving a pass, but when it's articulated as if they don't know, it's an option of a pass. And I don't want to um, uh, 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 provide that. I just think that it's like what Toni Morrison says about playing in her theory of playing in the dark, whiteness and the literary imagination, where her question that she raises after she wins all these accolades, the Pulitzer Prize and the Nobel Peace Prize, et cetera, is how in the world, right? I'm putting it more colloquial than she puts it. How in the world can you have all these Black people
Mhm.
in America and living around white authors, living in their very houses in whatever capacity, you know, and they not factor or figure into their text at all. And so she reads the Blackness in the text that's supposed to be absent of Blackness, and here's where it is. And
Mhm.
she's like, what kind of intellectual feats, had to go into configuring that kind of uh imaginary.
Mhm.
So I when Toni Morrison says something like that, I don't think she's giving them a pass. She, that's where I'm taking my notion or comment about not giving a pass. She's calling out where that it's impossible to deny this presence.
Yeah.
And although you have tried, it's still present in the ways in which you've tried to eviscerate or erase it.
Yeah, I mean, I like that, and it reminds me. So I still see a usefulness in, at least in my teaching, in I don't assign Eichmann and Jerusalem anymore, but I talk about it with my students, and I think that the brilliance of that book, of like that kind of Hannah Arendt's theorization around that, is like, if I could be very do a terrible job at summarizing, like Hannah Arendt goes to Jerusalem expecting to find the devil himself, and instead finds Adolf Eichmann as this like not very smart, balding, civil servant who was kind of like just following orders. But like the thrust of her book for me has always been that like the banality of evil is in our ability to separate our actions from their consequences. And so, the historians of the future might look back to the period, like this moment in time in 2024. The historians of the next century maybe look back at 2024 and think to themselves, like, given the evidence we have of what action governments took and didn't take, maybe they didn't know that they were on the verge of climate crisis. When of course we know we are headed towards climate doom right now. It's just that like we don't, it's also not that we don't care, it's that we're indifferent. We were able to separate our actions from their consequences for other people. Another good example of this I always talk to my students about is like, we all participate in structures of domination, whether we like it or not. Many of us, even as we fight for racial justice, we still eat animals, or we still wear clothes that are made by children in developing countries, and the idea here that it's not white ignorance, but rather white indifference, in the face of all of the evidence. And I think this is maybe what Toni Morrison's getting at, is like, the evidence is so clearly there. The Black people living around you, who are your neighbors, who are telling you things about their lives, and the dismissiveness and the indifference with which most white people take that in, and other people of color too. This is an interesting Canadian thing that we can talk about, is the racism in other kind of non-white community, the anti-Black racism in other non-Black communities. I think
that's definitely a conversation that has to be had, because racism tends to get, bifurcated in this Black-white
yeah,
paradigm, but it's particularly when it comes to Blackness, right?
totally.
Anti-Blackness is global.
Mhm.
It is a global phenomenon that impacts, infects, and it is ideologically imbibed in various racial groups of white, non-white, brown people of various backgrounds. This is a conversation that is very sensitive and delicate and
Yeah.
tenuous, because we tend to construct racism broadly as something that affects Black and brown people, and we don't unpack the ways in which there
Mhm.
still is a disparity, right, among Black and brown people. And it's a very difficult conversation
It's
to
so hard.
have.
Yeah, it's hard, and it has to be nuanced. And I have talked because this is the Center for Free Expression, I have talked in other venues about the need to, at some point, have a conversation about what I like to call like PPOC, which is problematic people of color. Really, 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 truly, because, people doing some work on this are doing so I'm thinking about the work of like Joe Lowndes and Dan Hosang, who are writing on the way in which the right, we think about Republican as like the party of the right and the white. Like there are huge contingents of the Asian American population, the Latinx population. The latest poll I saw about who would vote for Trump pitted 20% of Black men as voting for Trump. So like there are real conversations to be had here about the intersection of race and ideology and white supremacy. A lot of the leaders, Joe and Dan, right, of these like what we would normally call white nationalist movements are people of color. And like
Mhm.
we need to be very, very careful and theorize kind of like what is going on there. And in my book, I actually I try to talk about white liberals as, white's a power relationship. It's not a color, it's not a pigmentation. It's a power relationship. And in my book, I think I call Obama a white liberal at one point, because he is. And so thinking more about whiteness as a political status, as an invisible structure, as a set of power relations, I think is useful in that way. And also thinking more carefully about the ways that people of color like work to support white supremacy. Sometimes because it suits them. Sometimes it is to their advantage. Thinking about like Candace Owens, who is, I don't want to say what I think she is in case she watches this and then tries to sue me. But she has clearly seen some value in the way in which she parrots the racial dog whistles of other folks on the right, even as she trades in her Blackness for profit. It is interesting, and it deserves kind of careful analysis.
Mhm. And one of the things about how these conversations get played out or had or developed in the US versus Canada is different. I want to ask you about that in a moment, but what you just said made me think about in the US context, we can immediately point to figures
Mhm.
that occupy these sort of power positions in among Black people or different races. For example, Du
Mhm.
Bois versus Booker T. Washington,
Yeah. Mhm.
right? The radicalness of Du Bois, the sort of like Black advancement, as opposed to Washington, who's parroting, right, back to white racists and white supremacists, a kind of uh, um, acquiescence and partnership with them for what he understood to be how at least the Black people at his school at Tuskegee could advance and his own advancement. I think it's very interesting. I'm struggling to think in a Canadian context whether there are, discursive ideological paradigms that we can point to have this kind of conversation. I think it's a little more difficult.
It is because the people who are doing the most interesting radical work are not the ones who have the platform, and so, oh man, I don't want to like name names here. I'm gonna get sued, right? But like, I want to point to the work of my book was published around the same time, or maybe like a few months before another like fabulous book by L. Jones. It's called Abolitionist Intimacies. It's like it's the best book I've ever read, hands like it's incredible. I've signed it in all of my classes, and Elle is a force. And man, get her in front of an audience, get her in a debate with Wes Hall, and like we'll see who comes out on top. But my money's on Elle. But Elle's not the one who like spearheaded the Black North Initiative, but she's doing work, I would argue, with prisoners' rights, prison abolition, police abolition. That's much, 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 much more important than being Black on Bay Street.
100. You say something similar to Anthony Stewart, who we had a conversation with in the same venue about a year ago, I guess. And Anthony Stewart it's a Black Canadian born professor. He was a professor at Dalhousie. He gave up tenure to go to the US and take a position there. You say something similar in your book to what Anthony says. I want to juxtapose both of them. First, I'm going to say what Anthony said, then I'm going to say what you say. So Anthony says in his book, Visitor, My Life in Canada, he says, I have always felt as a Black-born Canadian like a visitor to Canada, even on my best days. That is a conversation Canadians have avoided having in public and need to begin having if Canada is going to live up to its claims of diversity and tolerance. That's what Anthony says. This is what you say. This is part of the reason why a sense of real belonging was, at least for me, always elusive in Canada. The kind of belonging I always wanted in the country of my birth, I instead sought in the country that enslaved my ancestors. There's a real similarity in these two discourses from two Canadian-born Black people. What's that about? I have a theory about it, but I mean, in Stewart's book is 2014. He's still, enlarging on that perspective and that in argument and in discourse about, as I said, he was here in this space about a year ago. And you're writing about a similar phenomenon.
Yeah. So I think I would have given you a different answer a couple of years ago, but now I am increasingly thinking about what it is that's unique about Canadian whiteness, because of course my sense of belonging in this country is shaped by Canadian whiteness, like obviously, and because Canadian whiteness is the dominant force. In this country. It's shaped our national identity, a sense of belonging, all of it. And I think it has an awful lot to do with immigration. And I think it has an awful lot. Now, I have not written this yet because I can't quite get it straight in my head, but bear with me. So it seems to me that especially when you compare Canada to the US, Canadians think of Canada as being a more egalitarian society. It is more equal. And like, look, the data bear that out, right? Like in part because Canada has a welfare state that actually functions, right? So you don't have the extraordinary poverty that you see in the US, right? But you also don't have the extraordinary wealth as in the US, right? The wealth gap in Canada exists. It is real. It is growing. It has grown over the past 40 years for sure. Some of that, the logic that we've seen that drove Occupy Wall Street absolutely exists in the Canadian context. But generally speaking, the redistributive function of the welfare state does mitigate some of that inequality. But because Canada is a more egalitarian society, the idea that it is also a meritocracy is stronger here than I would argue in the US. The idea that Canada is a meritocracy, that it is fundamentally a fair, good society, that if you work hard, it's not if you work hard, you will be anything, as in the American dream, but it's like anyone can do anything here because we don't have those systematic barriers, but because Canada doesn't have the same built-in systematic barriers, because Canada is a truer meritocracy than in the US, because Canada is a fairer place than many other Western democracies. And I think that does something to like to the creation of Canadian whiteness, in that like Canadian white folks cannot like and will not see systemic racism even when it's like staring them in the face, right? And so part of it is like the way in which like whiteness has manifested in the Canadian context. Part of it is again, like I grew up as like the only one there. Yeah, I write in the book about the way in which well into my 20s, people would always ask me, like, where are you from? No, where are you really from? And it was like that no, the negation, that was really the important part, right? Because it was, they'd say, where are you from? I'd say, from here. And they'd say, no, where are you really from? Right? Because what I know of myself isn't good enough, you know, for those white people who'd stop me on the street and like demand that I answer their question, because I didn't quite fit in their boxes, because they understand Canada as being fundamentally like a white country where people of color come from elsewhere, you know, because there's something interesting about the way that Canadians think about the relationship between temporality and belonging. Like the longer you've been here means that you belong more, which is nonsensical. That's a nonsensical measure of a person's commitment to a particular polity or society. So I think it has a lot to do with all of those things. And I'll tell you, when I moved to the US, like the US, I loved my time there. I loved it. I loved it. Like I moved back to Canada. You know, there's a couple of reasons I write about them in the book. I couldn't wrap my head around the gun violence, really. Like my daughter was having active shooter drills in her daycare. That was too much. And I was sure that Trump was going to win a second term. This was pre-COVID. I knew that he was going to change the Supreme Court for a generation. Yeah, and so like all of those factors, and also this job opened up at McGill, and Quebec has $8.35 a day daycare. My daycare bills went from $2,500 a month to $167. You know, like there were reasons why I came back to Canada, but I loved being in the US, in part because I finally had a sense of community, and it was like Black community. And I never had that in Canada. And again, I'm not saying this is true of all Black people. I know that folks who are living in Halifax have like a vibrant Black community. I know folks who live in parts of Toronto that are, you know, like full of like folks from Jamaica or whose parents are from Jamaica. I know like folks in Montreal Nord who have Haitian ancestry, have found communities, but I never did.
Yeah. You know, at some point in the future, I'm sure we'll have a chance to have other conversations. I'll tell you about what I think, which I'm still assessing about my
No,
experience
tell
in
me
Canada.
now.
Well, I've been here a decade, right? And I would never say that that I love my experience, right? I mean, it
In
is
Canada or in the
it's
US?
still, huh? In Canada,
Oh yeah, well.
in Canada. right? Like I'm still trying to figure out. Everybody's like, "Oh, you're in Canada. I want to go there." Oh, how don't you just love it? And so I get tongue-tied because I don't really want to say no. I mean, I just I want to think about it a little bit more, but it is let's say it's not Chicago. We're going to take some questions in a moment, Deborah, but I want to, before we do that, ask you about Chicago, because you know I'm from Chicago. I love Chicago. Love, love, love Chicago. Love the lake. People in the media, there's this people buy into the fear mongering around Chicago,
It's racist.
around like all they think that Chicago is one big slum. Um, and like Chicago is one of the most metropolitan, beautiful cities ever,
It's like my
anywhere.
favorite city. I love Chicago. It's one of my favorite cities, like hands down, bar
And
none.
so, I'm juxtaposing my earlier comment about being in Canada. I'm juxtaposing that with being from Chicago and loving Chicago. So, maybe Canada doesn't really have a fair chance with me and the pizza. So before we take questions, I want to ask you, like, what's your favorite pizza?
Oh my God, oh my God, don't hate me, but I don't like deep dish Chicago pizza.
You
I like
know,
No, I like the New York where you can like fold it in half and like eat it. I know. Terrible.
okay,
But you know what though? When I lived in Chicago, I lived down the street from this place that was like a Korean Mexican fusion. It was called like Tacos Coreanos, and it was like the best. It was the
okay.
best, and I've never found anything. I've never found anything as good as that was. It
There
was
is good food. There
yeah.
is good food. Okay, all right. So, Ange, we're ready for the first question.
Yeah, okay. The first question from an attendee, they say, in the introduction, Jim referred to the discussion of racism and how it slips and mutates across the Canada-US border. Could you talk some more about what each of you sees to be important differences in anti-Black racism in Canada and the United States?
So much. Yeah, let me start that. And because this is something I've been thinking about lately, in part because I have one of my new projects, I think we'll see what I end up doing, is on systemic racism in Canada. I'm interested in how systemic racism manifests here. And I think we don't know. That's the premise of my research project right now, is that we don't actually know how systemic racism works in Canada. And let me see if I can set this up. In the US, some aspects of systemic racism are very, very clearly the outcomes of policies, like explicitly racist policies that were embedded. And even after those policies were overturned, it kind of didn't matter because the interests had coalesced around particular preferences, right? So we don't have like redlining anymore, but we still have segregated neighborhoods because of other forms of institutions and other ways in which like that and those initial policies got embedded in the way people think and their behavior and the way that they act, right? So policy legacies moved like pushed forward. In Canada, we had explicitly racist laws on the policy. We on the books. We absolutely did. Like the Brown v. Board of Education was in 1954, and the last racially segregated school closed in Canada in 1968. 14 years later. So we absolutely had racist policies on the books. There was segregation. The case of Viola Desmond and Fred Christie allowed businesses to discriminate on the basis of race. FYI, both Viola Desmond, who's on the $10 bill, and Fred Christie, whose case was before her, they both left Canada because Canada was so racist, and they finished their lives in the United States, like FYI. So we had racist policies on the books, but they pertain to a very, very small population, as I've said before. And so the policy legacies that carried forward from those explicitly racist like laws and policies didn't have the same, like in poli sci, we call them feedback effects, right? Because the populations they were targeting were so small. And so I'm interested then in like if the reason, like what explains these racially disparate outcomes that we have along every socioeconomic indicator then, if it's not these racist policies that like we still feel their reverberations today, then what is it exactly? And I think, and like in my working hypothesis is that there's a lot of discretion that's been built into Canadian laws and policies that have enabled the agents of the state to discriminate without being held accountable. And so this kind of fits with like some of the historical circumstances of racism that we saw. For example, Canada never like banned Black immigration. Well, like there was an order in council in 1911 that banned Black immigration, but it was never actually put into effect. But instead, border agents were given the power to turn would-be immigrants away from the border if they felt that those immigrants were unsuitable to the climate and culture of Canada. And so immigration agents use that discretion to be racist, right? Canada never had any miscegenation laws on the books. Not exactly. The Indian Act's kind of wacky. But like people who issued marriage licenses just like wouldn't do that if a couple was interracial. And so I think that like discretion plays a pretty key role here. I think the way that our laws work and in the way in which we have to prove racial discrimination plays a pretty big role here. I think the way that power is centralized in our political institutions plays a big role. And I think that there are, in fact, just like some racists who have incredible amounts of power and then veto decisions or make decisions that work to entrench racial inequalities. So like that's one of my sense of the way that racism manifests differently. It's like you don't have that straight line from like racist policy to like racial disparity in Canada. We have to think about what are the other, I think I've been calling them mechanisms, like what are the other mechanisms that create and sustain racial inequality? That's like one example. Another example is like Canadians, like, man, like it's so different to teach about race in Canada versus the United States, in part because in the United States, when I taught my students about like race politics, everybody knows there's racism in the United States. Like even the racists know there's racism in the United States. And in Canada, I have to like convince my student, I have to teach them what race is. I have to teach them, like they don't know slavery happened in Canada. They don't know much about like the Indian Act regime. They don't like, and so like the starting point is so much further back in terms of the knowledge that we have to give like normal everyday Canadians about both racial history, like the racist history and the racist present, that we spend a lot of time just like catching people up, and we can't even get to the more interesting, detailed, nuanced analyses. Vey, what's your sense of the difference?
You know what? I was gonna say, yeah, 100%. I agree. I don't think I could add to that. That was very informed. Yeah, I agree. I don't even want to mess it up by trying to add something.
It's also there's one other thing is like there's something about so in Canada, like as Du Bois said, the problem of the color line is a problem of the problem of the 20th century is a problem of the color line. And Blackness has always been acknowledged as, slavery has been acknowledged as being key to racial formations in the US, Blackness, segregation, Jim Crow, all of it. And in Canada, I often hear a lot of like, why do we even have Black History Month in Canada? Like why, like Black people are like why? Black people are only 3.5% of the national population. Like, why don't we have, like, why are we celebrating Black history? Like, and so there's a lot of like that, like, why does Blackness matter here? Vey, do you think so?
See, that's a question that I can answer.
Okay.
we have Black History Month and why Blackness matters because you don't have modern advancement without Black people and Blackness, right? You don't have a cell phone without a Black person. You don't have open heart surgery without a Black person. You don't have blood transfusions without a Black person. You don't have being modernized cooking utensils without a Black person. This is what, but we don't know it or recognize. Like, you can point to all sorts of non-Black figures, or I would say white figures, that have influenced society and culture and technology and science. But there are so many more Black people who have influenced our culture and society that are unknown in the recesses. That's why we have Black History, in my case, year, right? Because we have to be able to recognize, understand, and point to the contributions that Black people have made to this world, right? That are constantly under erasure.
Yeah, agreed.
And we're ready for the next one.
Okay, and I do want to remind attendees that you can use the Q&A function to ask questions. The next question, an attendee asks, they say, in a wonderful article he wrote many years ago, Henry Louis Gates Jr., leading Black American public intellectual and head of the African American Studies Center at Harvard, wrote, if you really want to penalize wounding words, it makes no sense to single out gutter epithets, which are more likely to stigmatize the speaker than their intended victim, and leave the far more painful disquisition alone. The real power commanded by racism is likely to vary inversely with the vulgarity with which it is expressed. That sounds like what Debra was saying in the story that she told earlier. Has that been your experience as well, Vay?
Has that been my experience as well? Actually, I'm gonna need that put into like 10 words, because that was long. My experience in terms of what? Maybe Debra, maybe it sunk in with you more directly.
It's funny because I thought that that Gates quote was about was going into the debate about the N-word. Like I felt like that's where it was going, and then it kind of took a turn. Ange, can you read the question part of that question?
Like after the quote or the?
Yeah.
Okay, it just said that sounds like what Debra was saying in the story she told. Has that been your experience, Vay?
So like that the idea that like being called the N-word is, that's one thing. But really it's like the hatred that comes with other kinds of actions that matter more. I think that's kind of it. Like, so the effects of racist acts, whether they are slights or slurs, like, is it your experience? I think this is what the questioner is asking. Is it your experience that, like, which is like, people focus a lot on like the N-word, like, or slurs or violence, but is it your experience that other forms of racism can be equally or more damaging? And a questioner, if I got that wrong, like, write to Ange and correct me.
I would say, yes. Like, other forms are way, take this with a grain of salt, because I think the N-word is a violent epithet, although people know I have a nuanced understanding about that. And when it comes to Black linguistic practices in the public sphere, in schools or elsewhere, I am not a proponent of censoring the N-word, period, hands down. But I think that racial epithets like the N-word are too easy, right? I think they are used by people to say, oh, that is the paradigm of racist behavior. If you called someone the N-word, that is unequivocal that you are racist, right? And that is what we mean by what a racist person is. So, Debra, the reason why I liked your quote, in which that was your anecdote, in which the N-word was mentioned in your book, is because you are pointing to something different. You are pointing to say there is way more insidious and pernicious acts of racism that come from people who may never use the N-word.
Yeah.
or in situations where the N-word is never mentioned, right? And so that, if the person is asking if my experience is that there are these other forms that are more violent, more insidious, more pernicious, yes. And it is not located only in the N-word. I think the N-word too much has become a sort of straw man or straw word figure in order to for all of us who traffic in racisms every day to say that I'm not racist or I'm not participating in racism because I don't use that word and I think it's violent.
Yeah, I mean, if I can add to that, I think that one of the things that maybe people who have never been on the receiving end of racism, one of the things maybe that they don't get about it is when these insidiously racist things happen to you, like for me at least, I'm never like, holy crap, that was racist. I'm much more often like, what just happened there? I'm always, and it's not that I have internalized whiteness. It's that like the way in which racism manifests is so insidious that it's not always clear, even as it's happening to you, that what is in fact happening is like racism, and if you combine that with the fact that like I'm a person, Vay, you're a person, like I am very, very conflict averse, in spite of all appearances. I do not like confrontation. I am very small. I'm like 5'2" on my tippy toes, and like, so when racist things happen to me, I'm not always like ready, gearing up for a fight because it is frequently not safe for me to do so. And so like part of like the way in which racism manifests is in like that self-doubt, that inability to respond, the powerlessness that you feel because maybe it happened in a meeting where you were with the people who are about to vote on your tenure file. You were with like the teachers who have to see your children day after day. And do you fight with them when they can make your child's life a living hell for the next 8 months? Are you going to do that? Like, so there are all of these calculations that go through your head when something racist happens to you, and then you have to like convince white people that it was in fact racism on top of it. Like it's enough to like there's a reason, there's a footnote in my book. I talk about my father like having a stroke, and I say like if heart disease doesn't get us, racism will, or something. And then there's a very, very long passage about the relationship between racism and health, because it's estimated that at least 700,000 Black people die prematurely every year in the United States because of the stress of being Black in this world, like the stress of it all.
Yeah, it is so unbelievably stressful. It is so unbelievably stressful. And it's like, the everyday sort of encounters are, even more stressful, especially when, you have to ask yourself sometimes, wait a minute, was that, come on. I'm gonna give you some examples because listen, to me, it's every day, all day, every day, all day, right? So I go to the store, and I'm standing at the counter, like literally standing at the counter. The woman that's working behind the counter is having a conversation with someone else, right, who has already been served or whatever. And I'm standing there. Now I'm trying to be polite, right? I'm just standing there, but I'm like every other busy uh metropolitan person. But I wait deliberately because I want the situation to be explicitly clear. So I wait a while, interminable, and I'm never acknowledged, not at all, zero. And I'm the only customer standing there besides the person that she's having a conversation with. So then I finally say, am I going to get served, or must I wait until the conversation ends? Now, to speak up in that way, now I'm the bad guy, right? Now I'm the perpetrator and the aggressor of the situation, even though I stood there for probably 20 minutes. I mean, a really long time,
Mhm.
and was ignored. Same day, went to a car company, to a rental car company, to rent a car. I had already pre-booked, right? And you can put your driver's license in, your credit card, all that information in, and you show them the thing when you come in to say, I'm already checked in. Okay, so I have my phone. It's like, I'm already checked in. We need your driver's license and
Mhm.
your credit card. Okay,
Mhm.
you know what? Today, I'm not gonna be race Superman. I'm just gonna give you my credit card and my driver's license, even though I'm already checked in and your policy clearly say. Then another guy walks in, older gentleman, and he's like, "Oh, I'm here for a car." This person stops serving me, who's already checked in, to get my car, and completely waits on this. Now I'm
Mhm.
I- I'm flabbergasted at each occasion, even though it regularly happens, right? And there are more flabbergasted because it's still, you can't get really accustomed to being treated poorly and inhumanely. You just don't get accustomed to that. A lot of people choose not to speak up, or a lot of people choose to ignore it because, hey, you know what? It's going to cause a argument or a disagreement, and I'll just wait the 20 minutes while you worry with another person, get my car and get out of here.
Mhm.
But still, it's something that, on these things, that you have to you have to deal with. And people sometimes want the more um uh aggressive forms of this racism. Well, I have those too. I'm in the doctor's office. Okay, I said it happens all the time, every day, like 15, 20 times. My daughter's complaining of, common head cold, things like that. And so I take her to the doctor. She's 10. Do you know they asked me to step out the room so they can have a private conversation with a 10-year-old,
Mhm.
and then asked her the most. I stepped out, okay? Because I wanted to understand what was going on so I can use it basically to say, you see, I already knew what was happening, to make the most ugly insinuations and innuendo that you could imagine, right? Now, if I was a white father, middle class, educated, would that have happened,
Mhm.
right? And then when you call and complain to the college, right, the governing college of the physicians or whatever, their first response is they want to apologize to you on behalf, and they didn't mean it. You know what?
I mean,
What?
and the thing is too, and like for the people in the audience, like every Black person has a story that's either the exact same or so similar. Like as you were talking, I had forgotten about this, but there was a period of like 3 years when I was in the US when like every time I was lined up for like in Starbucks or anything, a white woman would cut in front of me in line. And it was by the end of it, it was like comical. I was just like, can you not see me? And the answer was like, yeah, they couldn't see me. Like that it would happen like every time I went anywhere where I had to line up, a white lady would literally cut in front of me in line for years. It was insane. It was and then COVID happened and nobody was in lines anymore. But yeah.
This is the thing about, we talked about literature and humanities and stuff earlier. In the opening scene of Invisible Man, I don't think people really get what Ralph Ellison is saying. So the book is a circle, right? He's underground. He's talking about, what happens in the opening scene. A white man, uh, he hits a white man, right? Like, just assaults him. And it's like he's still invisible. The invisible man is still, this Black figure that's right there is still invisible, no matter how he tries to get this attention of this. That goes through the entire novel about how that invisibility manifests in this whirlwind of this protagonist's experience through trying to go to university and not quite getting there, his relationships with other Black people, and then being in the city, all those things in Ralph Ellison's Invisible Man, to wind up underground opining or thinking about how he's going to get, what he's going to do when he goes back up. He's enlightened because the whole motif of the lights are down there, but still invisible. And do we have time for one more? And then we're going to go to Jim.
Yeah, the next question is from L. Jones. L says, you mentioned that Obama is a white liberal due to his outlook on life. I wondered if you could elaborate further on these contemporary power relationships where Black elites have gained more and more access to the halls of power. I'm thinking here about Ahmed Hussein colluding and cutting off funding to UNRWA, or the way Biden is currently leveraging the Black community against Muslim Americans, and the lack of challenge to these actions from Black groups. How do we navigate these factors in our liberatory movements? And she says, great talk. Hello.
Hi, Elle. Yay, Elle's book. Everyone should get Elle's book. It's amazing, amazing. I love this question, Vay. I'm super interested in what you think about it. I think that, I mean, like it's interesting in the Canadian context in particular. I don't find it super surprising in the American context, because Americans love their like mythological heroes who like fought against, I don't know, like the wilderness, or who rose up singularly. Like that's part of like the American like national mythology is like a singular hero, and anti-heroes as well, as of late. And so it's even more interesting in the Canadian context when it happens, when we like pinpoint these like Black elites as indicative of, as like the spokespeople for our communities, or they appoint themselves, right? And I'm always like, whenever someone has appointed themselves as a spokesperson, as like a success story, I'm always like, that always strikes me as being like super, super problematic. And in part because like it's frequently an attempt to demonstrate how possible it is for anyone to do and be kind of like to get a position of power. One, of course, it's in fact impossible for nearly everyone else because of systemic barriers that go like unnoticed and like uncriticized. I also think that, and this is like part of the discourse of Black Lives Matter, and what like Deva Woodley writes about in her book Reckoning, is the way that Black elites frequently try to dilute and co-opt like radical demands in order to make them more palatable, more marketable, more profitable, whatever. And whether or not it's possible for people to have these like radical, in Elle's case, like abolitionist, liberatory like principles, and get to those positions of power. Like I actually think it's not possible given the way that Canadian political parties work. I don't think it's possible given the way that like capitalism works. I don't think it's possible to get to a position of power in most industries and still maintain like a core ethic of radicalism, liberation, like fairness, equality. Like it's really, really challenging. And the times that we're able to encounter like Black leaders who have a moral core, who like are able to retain those those values, those political commitments, and still like make it into the halls of power, I think those are I think those are rare. I think those are rare like gems. because the other part of it, I wonder, and I think if Elle were here, I would love to hear what like she had to say about this, is I think that a lot of people who have those types of political commitments are not necessarily drawn to those positions. Like, I think that those of us who have like a calling to do good work, like try to do that good work outside of the formal realm of politics. Like, I'm definitely like, I'm not an organizer, that's not my forte, but I'm a good teacher, and so I always think about my contribution to the fight for racial justice as like in the world of education. And just so we're clear, I'm actually one of those people where like I do think we need people like everywhere. Like, I think we need organizers. I think we need activists. I think we need academics. I think we need lawyers. I think we need judges. I think we need like entrepreneurs, I guess, like, I think we need, like, everyone but cops. I don't think we need cops, but like, I think that we need people everywhere in every industry, in every organization, because there's white supremacy everywhere in every industry, in every organization. But I think police are irredeemable. And so I would not encourage anyone to do or become that.
Well, we committed to a certain time period for our conversation, although we could go on and on and on and on. So we're going to invite Jim back to help us conclude. But before he does that, I want to encourage people in the audience who've listened to this conversation to spearhead more of these conversations, to have them at the library, to have Zoom talks, to make these kinds of conversations more regular, right? Jim?
I couldn't get my camera unmuted. Listen, I want to thank the two of you. I thought this was an incredibly stimulating, thought-provoking, important conversation. And I'd second what Vey had just suggested to encourage more of these conversations. I want to thank the audience for your participation. Unfortunately, a whole bunch of questions came in near the end, so we didn't get to all of them. And I wish we had had the time to do that. A video of today's conversation is going to be posted on the Center for Free Expression website tomorrow. So those of you who would like to share what you heard today with colleagues or friends or people in your network, please go get the link and send that around. We're also going to post with it a list of resources. So if there are things you'd like to dig into more on this, both Debra and Vey are going to suggest some additional readings that you could look at or other materials that would allow you to explore the issues that were raised today even more fully. So thank you for coming. Our website is cfe.torontomu.ca. Our next event, which is going to be in March, it's going to be Tuesday, March 19th, is going to look at what's happening in the discourse about Palestine and Israel. It's titled Finding a Way Forward for Jews and Palestinians in This Terrible Time. And it's going to feature two really interesting writers and academics, Raja Khoury and Jeffrey Wilkinson. Raja and Jeffrey have written a book called The Wall Between Us, What Jews and Palestinians Don't Want to Know About Each Other, and really explore what we need to do to try to find a way of coming together. So they're going to be in conversation with Mira Sokolov, who's a political scientist at Carleton University who specializes in Israeli-Palestinian relations. So it should be a really provoking and difficult discussion. It's one that is often suppressed. I mean, it's a very hard kind of discussion to have these days when it's absolutely necessary. So I hope you'll tune in for it. It's going to be Tuesday, March 19th at 7 p.m. Eastern Time. And for more information about our other upcoming events, as well as videos of our previous ones, including some of the ones that Vey mentioned today, go to our website, cfe.torontomu.ca. Thank you all very much, and we're pleased that you were able to join us today.